Good morning, all. It is Dr. Ryan Mattel here, back with episode 2 of Tales from the Workshop. Had a bit of a lukewarm response on the first video, so we'll see how this one goes. Hopefully, this one's a bit more entertaining for you. Now, as I mentioned on yesterday's podcast, the 31st of March this week was the 100th anniversary of the formation of the Royal Australian Air Force. And today I've assembled a few of my old Australian aircraft that I've put together over the years to sort of just give you a rundown on them. So we'll start with the first one, which got its makeover recently. This is a Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawk, also known as the Tomahawk or P-40 Warhawk. Went under a few different guises during the war, depending on the model. This one, I'm not 100% sure which model P-40 it is. All I know is that it is a P-40. These were supplied to Australia by the United States Army Air Force shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and sort of around the time that Darwin was first bombed. Here it is. I recently repainted it in the green and grey that the RAAF traditionally used during the war. This was one of the first models I actually bought, so I had a very unhistoric paint job on it. It was an assortment of like greens and yellows and all sorts of weird stuff. I think the underside was a bronze color or something, but yeah, I gave it a repaint. Gave it all that, made sure to keep the decals still. Repainted the underside. So you can see there, it's got a more of a traditional white underside there. The P-40 itself was powered by a Allison V12 engine, and it was armed, if I can just fix the stand up here, it was armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, just here, in this part of the wing here, and over here as well. The P-40 pretty much served everywhere during the war. It was in the Pacific, it was in North Africa, it served in Italy, it served in Europe. The French used the earlier versions of it, the P-36, known as the Hawk. It even served all the way up in Alaska, fighting the Japanese during the Aleutian Islands campaign in 1942 and 43. You'll see here the RAAF roundels traditionally are just the blue with the white circle. Originally, we did use the same roundels that the RAF used, which are very similar to this, just with a red dot in the center. The reason we stopped using those is from a distance, a lot of people were mistaking the red dot for the Japanese rising sun emblem, and as a result, they were getting shot down. There were cases of friendly fire, mistaken identity. The United States actually had a similar issue with their markings. Their original white star actually used to have a red dot in it as well, but they quickly changed that after, I believe it was the Battle of Coral Sea in 1942. So the Australian P-40s served mainly in New Guinea against the Japanese, and in Darwin for home defence. Shot down a few bombers and fighters that came over. The Royal New Zealand Air Force actually also used these quite a lot as well in an offensive role across the Pacific. The Kiwis will actually pop up a little bit later in this video as well. So that's my P-40. I'm very proud of the touch job I did on it. It looks a lot better than it did, and hopefully the video does it justice. The main part of this video, though, is about these 3 little babies. These are Commonwealth CA-13 boomerangs. These are the only Australian-built and Australian-designed aircraft to ever see combat and to ever be built, really. These were an early to mid-war design, and unfortunately, these are some of the oldest ones I have. I've had these since about grade 10. And they're all in varying levels of, I suppose, disrepair. Unfortunately, the rear one here lost its tail, half its tail. This one here has lost one of its guns. This one, though, I'm happy is happy to say is still the most complete example. It's just missing a propeller, but you know, we could just make it look like it's taxiing or something like that. A little bit of history on the Commonwealth boomerangs. So, come Pearl Harbor, the attacks on Darwin, and the Japanese advance across the Pacific and whatnot during 1941 and 42, the Australian military was very concerned about the Japanese potentially invading Australia. And at the time, a lot of our forces were tied up in the Middle East with Britain, by fighting in North Africa and whatnot, and the Americans didn't have a lot of spare stuff at the time due to obviously them fighting the Japanese in the Philippines and across the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. So the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, which is based down in Fisherman's Bend in Melbourne, the capital city of Victoria, I've actually had the pleasure of actually going there and going to Fisherman's Wharf, which was pretty cool back a couple of years ago. They designed their own fighter aircraft to protect Australia. And this is what they came up with, the CA-13 Boomerang. It was based off of the Commonwealth Aircraft's Wirraway trainer, which, for those unfamiliar with it, is similar to a T6 Texan in terms of appearance. Very, very similar performance and similar role. The Wirraway actually also served as a light bomber and light attack aircraft and an emergency fighter in some cases. So it uses the same engine as the... Sorry, I just grabbed this. Uses the same engine as the Wirraway. It's a Pratt & Whitney radial. The tail section and the wings are also based off of the Wirraway, I believe. The armament was actually pretty good for a fighter of its era. In the wings here, it had two 303 Browning machine guns in either wing, similar to the Brownings you'd find on a Hurricane or a Spitfire. But it also had two of these little sticks here. These are Hispano 20mm cannons. Cannon-armed aircraft were a big thing in World War II. And early on it became apparent that these things were going to be the future. Machine guns, which were basically firing rifle caliber bullets, were slowly phased out, and it got to a point where aircraft were just cannon armed exclusively. So the Boomerang was built and tested. Several hundred of these were built, and they served mainly in Australia. By the time that the Boomerang was actually built in sufficient numbers to equip several squadrons, the main threat of the Japanese invasion had passed. By that point, aircraft such as the P-40 had already become available to us. There wasn't necessarily anything wrong with the aircraft, it just simply wasn't needed anymore. So they used it mainly in home defense roles. There was only one case of it actually seeing combat with another aircraft. One of them tried to intercept a Japanese bomber near Darwin, and unfortunately when it got into range the guns jammed, so it was forced to go back to base. So the little Boomerang never actually drew blood. Several were lost in accidents though, so it did drew blood, but on the wrong side. It did, however, find a second wind in its career later in the war, during the campaign to take back the island of Bougainville from the Japanese. Bougainville's a very large island in the Solomons. It was a strategically important area. The fighting there went on right until almost the end of the war in 1945. And the Boomerangs actually found themselves a second wind, serving with the RAAF, but serving alongside our Kiwi bros at the Royal New Zealand Air Force. By the time the Bougainville campaign rolled around, they had traded their P-40s in for the American-built F-4 Corsair fighter bomber, which was arguably one of the finest aircraft of World War II and could carry a stupid amount of ordnance. So the New Zealand Air Force Corsairs were fighting in Bougainville in a ground attack role, and the Boomerangs actually found a second wind being their sort of spotters as such. The engine, unfortunately, was not supercharged, so it was not suited for high-altitude aerial warfare. There was a single example built called the CA-14, which did have a supercharged engine. It did fly, and it did work, but it just simply wasn't needed by the time it was built. But it was very good at low-level and mid-level combat, which made it... And it was a rugged, small little aircraft, which made it well-suited for ground attack roles. So traditionally, these things would go in first, strafing troop positions and whatnot, and then marking the heavier bunkers and whatnot for the New Zealand Corsairs, which would come in with their bombs and their rockets and just plaster the target in ordnance. So it was a good little Anzac team there. The Boomerangs and the Corsairs working together. The Boomerangs would also sort of act as a pseudo fighter escort for the Corsairs, because whilst the Corsairs themselves were fighter aircraft, until they actually unloaded their ordnance, they were pretty vulnerable, because they would normally have a couple of bombs and rockets strapped to them, which would obviously weigh them down, make them a bit sluggish. So the Boomerangs would traditionally keep an eye out for them. I actually had the pleasure of seeing one of these in the flesh down at the RAAF Museum in Point Cook in Victoria a couple of years ago, which was a dream come true for me. I didn't even know the Boomerang existed until around the start of grade 8, I believe, because my mother bought me a book, a very good World War II book, written and illustrated by a chap named Bill Gunston, who I have come across several times over the years. And it was in that book that I first read about the Boomerang, and when they first talked about its history, its combat role and whatnot. And back then I was obsessed with anything Australian. I was a good little patriot. And the idea that Australia had built its own... This was also around the time when I was big on fighter planes and wanted to be a pilot and all that sort of thing. So finding out that Australia had built their own fighter aircraft during the war was just a massive boon for me. And from that point on, I became obsessed with it. I would build Lego models of these things. I would fly them around. I'd do drawings, paint them up my own, like drew the drawings up my own camouflage schemes and all that sort of stuff. And then finally in grade 10... Airfix actually released the kit of this thing, and as you can see, I went a little crazy and I bought 3 of them. I actually bought 4. One of them was for a kit bash. I'd actually designed a sort of hybrid between these things and the F4U Corsair in one of the novels I was writing at the time, and I decided to try and build my own version of it, sort of a super Boomerang. And I don't know whatever happened to it. Guessing it was lost to the ether of moving over the years. So you can kind of see my the evolution of my painting on these things. These are all in their original colours too. These are all in paint that is now, where are we? 2021. 16 years old. So this was the first one I did. Wasn't the most historically accurate paint job. Sort of tried to go for the green and the brown that the Australian Air Force did use. I used the wrong brown though. As you can see, unfortunately, missing the tailplane there, but I still keep her. One day I'll try and fix it up, maybe turn it into a diorama or something. This was the second one I built, and this is the one I'm probably the most proud of because it actually came out the best. This is another colour scheme that the RAAF used a lot. It was just a flat bronze green, I believe they call it. Some of our P40s were also painted that way. The only difference being they had a white tail, and I believe they also had a bit of white on the wing tips as well. But this one has remained intact the most, which I'm quite proud of, because as I said, this is the one that I'm most proud of. It's most historically accurate, and as I say that, I almost dropped it and smashed the landing gear, so good job, Doctor. Great work there. And then this was the third one I built. This one I went for the green and brown camouflage. I got closer to the real brown this time, but still wasn't 100% accurate. As you can see, one of the Hispanos has fallen off. This particular example, if I can turn it around, Susie Q. This one actually is still around today. It is owned by the Temora Aviation Museum down south. And it looks pretty much exactly like this, and it is still flying. You see it at air shows and things. It was a part of the flyover for the 100th anniversary in Canberra this week. So you can actually go and see that aircraft still. As I said, they've also got one down in Melbourne that you can go see at the Point Cook RAAF Museum. I believe there are a couple of other ones around. I think there's one up in Darwin as well. So there's a couple of them still around, which is good. So that's my little RAAF squadron. I do have a couple more that are in storage at the moment with moving and whatnot. I've got a couple of F-111 fighter bombers. I've also got a Mirage that I haven't built as yet, So that's sort of the history of Australia and our little boomerangs and little P40 as well. Quite proud of these little things. I'm very proud that they've stood the test of time despite everything they've been through. They've been through several moves. They've obviously also been through a decade and a half of just regular wear and tear. And I'm very impressed, especially with this one. Like the bronze green on it still is almost brand new. I had to dust them off. Been sitting on the shelf for a while, but man, they came up okay. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed my little tour today. Let me know what you think down below. Let me know if you want to see more of this as well, because I've got plenty more where that came from. So until next time, folks, stay safe, stay happy. It's still nice and cold and rainy here in Brisbane, so I'm going to have a nice day in just playing games and whatnot. So take care, and we'll see you in the next episode.